And go ahead and kick us off here. So, hello everyone. I am Marissa Olszewski. I'm the Environment and Community Program Manager for Maryland League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. Building on our popular weekly Friday Digest series, which we host during Maryland's legislative session, Conservation Conversations is our monthly Lunch and Learn series where we dive into environmental and conservation issues in Maryland. These conversations are designed to give you context and information about environmental policies and their impacts on your community. We do keep these brief, only 30 minutes each, so they will provide a good introduction, but not a deep dive into the topics we're covering. And you can catch any of them on our YouTube channel after the fact. To recap today, this conversation is all about the money. Specifically, we're talking about federal budget reconciliation, the Federal Budget Reconciliation Act, H.R. 1, which they have titled the Big Beautiful Bill. In case you just need the full context, we will call it H.R. 1 here, and how it is affecting climate policy, clean energy, environmental justice, and how Maryland is responding. We're going to touch on what this bill means for Maryland's communities, our state budget, and how we're adapting to a very different federal landscape. Today, we're joined by two expert guests. Lashelle Johnson is National LCV's State Equity Policy Director, who will help us understand the national implications and equity considerations of H.R. 1. And Tim Lattimer is Howard County's Community Sustainability Administrator, who will share how these federal changes are affecting local communities and what Maryland can do in response. Thank you both very much for being here this afternoon. So to start and set the stage, let's just start from the very basics. Lashelle, can you help us understand what is budget reconciliation? What's a budget reconciliation bill? Why is H.R. 1 so significant for environmental policy?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I will do my best. So in order to understand reconciliation, I think it's useful to talk briefly about how the federal budget works. The fiscal year begins on October 1st, and in order to make that deadline, ideally, Congress is required to adopt a budget and a budget resolution by April 15th. The budget resolutions aren't laws, right? So they don't have to be signed by the president. They're basically just an outline of the top spending or debt or tax priorities, and they're agreed upon with identical language by the House and the Senate. So what reconciliation is a directive that can be included in that budget resolution. And those instructions are what tells Congress to write legislation that will meet new revenue or new spending goals. And that's what ultimately becomes a reconciliation bill. So this usually happens in moments where there's a party trifecta, because the point of this reconciliation process is to provide an easier avenue to passing legislation that meets the goals of the budget. So what this reconciliation bill did, H.R. 1, what it did for the environment specifically was pick winners and losers, and the winners being coal barons and oil executives, and the losers being basically everyone else on the planet. So the reconciliation bill cut investments in clean energy technologies. It cut funding to train people to do things like energy efficiency upgrades that would save me and you, everyday people, money. It cut billions of dollars meant to remediate the legacy of environmental racism and ensure that low-income communities and communities of color are given access to the clean transition. So it did a lot of really terrible things.
That's very helpful context. And I'm going to have you now actually dive more specifically into some of those programs that we saw impacted. I know as this was all coming into fruition, there was a lot of talk about the Inflation Reduction Act programs, which here at Maryland LCV, we've worked very closely on getting the word out about those and getting those implemented over the past few years since that bill passed. And I know a lot of those were included in this rescission, at least those that were not already implemented. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. It's a lot, so I'll try and do as good of an overview as I can. And you are correct. Almost all of the programs in the Inflation Reduction Act were rescinded or repealed or otherwise changed. The a list of them is very, very long, but some highlights: the Environmental and Climate Justice Program was rescinded, which provided billions of dollars to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, for financial and technical assistance to carry out a bunch of environmental and climate justice activities that included things like the Community Change Grants Program, which were grants given directly to community organizations to reduce pollution. It included cutting funding for the Thriving Communities programs, both grant making and the technical assistance centers, which got hundreds of millions of dollars to provide free technical assistance, training, capacity building to communities. And all unobligated funds for that program were rescinded. Folks might hear that term a lot, unobligated funds. Under normal circumstances, that means that any funding that hasn't been agreed upon, funding that there's not a contract for, money that's still in the bank, that would be it wouldn't go out. That would be taken back. But anything that the government already agreed to provide, any obligated funds, would still be accessible to organizations that got that money. What we do know is that this administration is not following the rule of law in that way. We saw that earlier this year when they were freezing the release of obligated funds and just wouldn't send them out until they were being sued, basically. So want to note that you'll hear unobligated funds versus obligated funds, but a lot of this is up in the air and requires very intense scrutiny in order to track. But back to programs, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was completely repealed. And a repeal means that we would need to pass another law to get it back. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was a suite of programs with $27 billion to finance projects and activities to lower energy costs and address the climate crisis. That included the Solar for All program, which was already providing funding in communities to develop solar projects. The reconciliation bill cut funding for clean heavy duty vehicles grants, which again were already super successful in accelerating replacement of things like diesel school buses with ones that don't pollute the air as they're driving kids to school. The climate pollution reduction grants had their funding rescinded, a personal favorite program of mine and a program that I think is extremely important, which was $4.7 billion that was meant to help states and cities and tribal governments address climate pollution in their states. So for Maryland, that included $250 million for the Clean Corridor Coalition, which was going to develop hundreds of truck charging sites up I-95 from Maryland to New Jersey, and also the $420 million program through the Atlantic Conservation Coalition, which was going to support Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas to protect and restore coastal habitats. In Maryland, that meant restoring native ecosystems by planting hundreds of trees and millions of native wetland species and improving the water quality in the bay and improving the management of the forests in Appalachia. What we don't know transparently is how far along some of these projects were. And we would need to check in with them directly to ask those questions of if they've gotten that funding, if it's being held, if the projects are being canceled. So overall, it's extremely difficult to track. And then two other programs worth noting. The reconciliation bill cut a ton of electric transmission funding. So transmission is what gets the energy or electricity from point A to point B, and is extremely vital to our society. Our electric grid is made up of transmission lines and the distribution system that we don't have to get super wonky about. But our grid hasn't been updated in 70 plus years. So the reconciliation bill cut the financing and the grants to build new transmission and to update our grid. It cut the funding to support states, including Maryland, working together with their neighbors in order to build a more interconnected future, and leaves us yet again in the past with a system that can't sustain us. And as you all probably know, finally, it cut a bunch of rebates. The rebates for stoves, for replacing your AC or heater with a heat pump, the rebates for making electric vehicles more affordable for people. And that's just a smattering of a very small pocket of all of the programs that were cut by this bill.
So with that context, thank you, Lashelle. We have clearly lost some of the momentum that we had going on climate programs and environmental programs in Maryland, as well as across the country. I'd like to turn to you, Tim, to talk about your perspective working in Howard County and what you're seeing in terms of how these federal changes, the changes to funding obligations, and other programs mentioned, Lashelle, or maybe things she hasn't mentioned, how those are affecting our local environmental programs or planning from your perspective.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Marissa, for inviting me to join you all. I realize we have a very short window of time here, so I'll try to keep it brief. I would say there's a couple of things. One, we're looking at both direct impacts as well as indirect impacts. And what I mean by direct impacts, Lashelle already mentioned, for example, when the Solar for All program was being frozen for a while, right? We were in line to get grant money from the state through that program to help us in installing solar canopies over several sites here in Howard County. And I would just say also, I mean, we have a very ambitious climate action plan. Our climate forward plan calls for us to achieve 60% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2045. It was already going to be a steep uphill climb to achieve those goals. And we were doing as much as we possibly could to promote clean energy development in Howard County, encourage folks to look at adopting electric vehicles, to make that switch from fossil fuel heating to electric heat pumps and things like that. So, these cutbacks are having an impact on our ability to sort of move those kinds of changes as rapidly as we need to achieve our goals. I mean, that the Solar for All program was unfrozen, so we were able to get 2.3 million in state funding to try to move this solar canopy project forward, but we still, it delayed us, and we are still now in the process of just soliciting bids for the work to be done. Indirectly, I would also just say that the federal funding cuts that have rippled through the economy have forced the county to absorb more costs that previously we might have gotten federal support for. For example, a number of county departments depended on grant funding for a number of positions, including our Office of Emergency Management, which is critical for helping us in maintaining our resiliency to the impacts of climate change, as well as workforce development and other social service programs. We estimate that we've got about a fourth of Howard County's workforce that is being impacted by federal funding and workforce decisions that are happening now. So we're talking about tens of thousands of affected workers. So as a result, our counties had to reallocate resources to make sure that we are providing the kind of support for those that are being displaced, either federal workers that are direct hires or those who are working for federal contractors that are also being affected, both private sector and civil society organizations. As one direct result of that, I could say we had about $500,000 allocated by the county council for us to get some additional EV charging facilities installed at multifamily housing developments managed by our housing commission. Those monies had to be reallocated to help provide the kind of support for displaced federal workers. So that's slowing down our ability to get EV charging into communities that would want it and need it. So that's a challenge for us. So that's just a flavor of the kinds of things that we're wrestling with. We're looking to try to do everything we can to continue to encourage clean energy development and encouraging folks to adopt electrification and so on. But it does make the uphill climb that much steeper. I like to say that before we had the wind in our sails, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. Now we've got very severe headwinds that we're going to have to figure out how we're going to tack to find our way forward.
A good sailing metaphor. I appreciate that. Lashelle, Tim just talked about some of those indirect impacts, those other impacts. And while we're focusing today on the environmental impacts from HR1, there were a number of other economic pieces in there that are going to affect people and government budgets. So we're seeing these impacts that are beyond environmental programs. Can you touch on a few of those things that LCB has seen in the HR1 package that are like the healthcare costs and energy costs that Maryland families will also have to absorb as part of that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, climate wasn't the only thing that was targeted in the reconciliation bill, and all of these things are compounding and will have a compounding impact on people. So for us, obviously, we're gonna see our energy bills increase by $100 to $200 annually. But we'll see college is going to become more inaccessible to people by changing the way that Pell Grants work and eliminating certain loan repayments and putting caps on lifetime loans. On Medicaid, some states, I think all states will have to require a $35 copay for some services for Medicaid. We're going to see 8 million people who were on marketplace insurance lose their coverage. That means premiums are probably going to go up for everyone else in the marketplace. Low-income households who are relying on SNAP benefits are going to see massive cuts. 600,000 households are going to have their benefits cut by $100 a month, which drastically reduces people's access to food. So when you think of you have less money to spend on groceries, your electric bill is going up, you have to pay for more services than you did before. You have a $35 copay every time you need to go to the doctor now. There's just all of these things compound on top of each other, on top of all of the rescissions, the money that's been taken away from communities to help bridge some of these gaps. So it's overall extremely concerning and is going to upend quite a large pocket of society. And to Tim's point, it means that governments, state governments, local governments are going to have to pick up the bill for a lot of this and cannot spend as much money on other things anymore.
Right. And we will see that challenge again as we face our state budget when we come into January. And Maryland LCB is already looking at the state budget and watching that and trying to figure out how we can encourage the state to be creative in their budgeting so that we can help fill some of these gaps that were previously covered by the federal government so people's needs can be met while also not falling back on all of our environmental programs, right? Speaking of that as well, Lashelle, there was one other piece that I was hoping to have you talk about, the environmental justice block grants that affect communities. And they were one of those pieces that was built into the IRA that I believe has been rescinded. Can you talk about those programs, please?
Yeah, I hate to be the bearer of so much bad news for y'all today.
Sorry, I'm making that your job here.
But yeah, there were a lot of programs that were built to remediate past harms, whether that was pollution or air quality or the historic divestment that left communities without the capacity to engage deeply in processes that impacted them. As I mentioned earlier, there were $3 billion for community-led solutions. So those grants were funding organizations directly to address the needs in their communities. The community change grants were for everything from community-led pollution monitoring to remediation to workforce development. There was funding to reduce health risks from climate change, to reduce extreme heat, to reduce the urban heat island effect, to mitigate climate disasters like wildfires. And as extreme weather events become more frequent, communities that have historically not been invested in, environmental justice communities specifically, are less resilient to climate impacts. Like my childhood neighborhood was prone to flooding, like so prone to flooding that my mother and I had an entire system worked out of which roads we could drive on and where we needed to park and what way we would walk to get home if it rained too much. And those are the types of problems that could have been fixed with this funding in environmental justice communities. But communities like mine generally don't have the time or the access to systems and processes. We need to fix those things on our own. And many communities like mine are just not where cities invest their money. So these programs that were rescinded were meant to repair that harm, repair that lack of investment, and bridge that gap to support communities directly, to support the city and counties that those communities were in. But now if local governments and states and people like us aren't fighting for it, those same communities are going to be left in the lurch again, especially considering that this administration has a propensity for sitting on funding, as Tim mentioned earlier, and that's already creating budget crises everywhere. We're seeing it in every state. We're seeing it in a lot of counties and a lot of cities. And environmental justice communities are and will continue to be at greater risks of disastrous impacts without this funding, and are going to bear a lot of the burden for these the funding being rescinded from all of these programs. Like $3 billion is nothing to sneeze at, especially because it was providing free technical assistance. It was skilling up counties. It was making sure that they had access to the systems and the processes to write these big federal grants and to do the things they needed to do in order to be able to have solar gardens or to have remediation. But yeah, it's extremely concerning across the board. And I'm very worried about my communities and all of ours.
Thank you. I will say I should note at this moment that the Governor Moore did issue an executive order just last week focused on environmental justice. So just to bring it back to Maryland, it's good to live in a state where we are trying to do things to continue to move environmental justice communities forward and to continue to center them. And hopefully we will see more of that come the legislative session, but stay tuned come January. In the meantime, Tim, I wanted to come back to you and talk about climate change in particular and how Howard County has been tackling that. Your county has seen impacts of extreme weather in very dramatic fashion. If people remember flooding in Ellicott City in 2016 and then again in 2018, those sorts of frequent flooding events and extreme flooding events are becoming more of a challenge and more frequent through climate change. I think in the past, Howard County has benefited from funding to help mitigate since those flooding disasters. And I wanted to have you talk a little bit more about how you're working on mitigating and adapting for these climate impacts.
Sure. Thank you, Marissa. If you don't mind, I'm going to try to just share my screen here too to just kind of illustrate a couple of points here.
Got some visuals.
If you all can see that, hopefully. There we go.
Looks good.
How's that? We good?
Yep.
Just to orient everybody, I'm sure everybody on the call knows where Howard County is, but if you're calling from outside Maryland, we're situated between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. in that area in yellow. Ellicott City, historic Ellicott City, was one of the first industrialized cities in the nation. And way back when, the mill that was built along the Patapsco River took advantage of the flow from multiple tributaries that converge on Main Street in Old Ellicott City. And as Marissa mentioned, we've had devastating floods in recent years. The ones in 2016 and again in 2018, they occurred 22 months apart. Each of those were considered 1,000-year floods. So, they had devastating economic consequences for the area. And we have since County Executive Ball came in December of 2018. First order of business was to initiate the Ellicott City Safe and Sound program. And that is something that was developed in consultation with folks in the community about ways we could best try to mitigate and avoid future such floods. In years past, before this century, floods typically would come from the Patapsco River from things like Hurricane Agnes back in, I think it was 1972, where the river rose and flooded Main Street. Now the floods have been coming from the upper tributaries heading down toward the Patapsco River. So we are now in the middle of implementing this plan, which includes a number of stormwater retention basins in upstream areas. Some of those have been completed, others are under construction or in design. We are also, for the centerpiece of this, we are going to be boring a mile-long tunnel under Old Ellicott City. And the tunnel boring machine is due to arrive here this fall. We'll be dropping it down about 100, 150 feet to begin boring this tunnel under the old city to convey floodwaters directly to the Patapsco River. And so, as you can see, we've got this sort of complex of retention basins plus this conveyance that will bring floodwaters directly to the Patapsco River. This is giving you a profile of it, so you can see, well, the outfall will be right here, just at the edge of the Patapsco River, which is the boundary between Howard and Baltimore counties.
Yeah.
That's our largest public works project in county history. It's about $150 million undertaking. The county did raise funding both from local sources, state and federal sources. We had a federal funding, I think it was about 20 some million dollars. So far, we are still proceeding and moving this project forward. But it's always a little unnerving when you have the kind of unpredictable decision-making, to put it mildly, by the federal government. And I think that's something that affects our ability to plan and our ability to have some sense of security that we're going to be able to finish as scheduled. This project, the tunnel boring, will be going on for about a year. I think it's scheduled to be done in late 2027. So that's the kind of challenge that we face here, which is to have that security to know that we can get these things done. So beyond the uncertainty about whether or not tax credits will be available for clean energy development and that sort of thing, we also have this on the resiliency side. And if I could just add to what Lashelle mentioned earlier, in addition to the funding cuts that affect programs and grants and that sort of thing, we've also seen the federal government pulling down information tools and resources, whether it's online information that's been produced over the years by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or online tools that the EPA and Department of Energy have that help us in doing our analysis and in doing our calculations. These are things that will make our work that much more difficult to carry out. And it also makes it harder for us to have confidence in data. If we no longer have for example, a national climate assessment that was being produced about every 4 years by under a congressional mandate, they've suspended doing that now. So the kind of data resources that we rely on to understand what is happening with the climate and how we can best deal with it, that's being undermined.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciate you sharing about the Ellicott City project, because I think it also does a great job of reminding us of the scale of the kinds of projects that are going to be needed if we're going to adapt to the changes that we're seeing. We have a very short amount of time left, and I just want to make sure that we get a chance to give people a little bit more of a proactive, what can they do? How can we respond? So maybe if we can turn ourselves to a slightly more hopeful aspect in our last minute. Lashelle, what have you got for us? What can people do?
So many things. I think, first point of order, showing up here for these conversations. That's great. Getting involved with Maryland LCV, a great team of people, got lots of things where you can get involved. And then sharing your stories. I know it's cliche to say, call your members of Congress, but what they're talking about on the floor and what they're using to make their cases are your stories. They don't need people like me and my colleagues giving them all the details and all the wonkery. They'll get that, but what they need from you is how these things are impacting you, how these things are impacting your county and your community. So please, feel empowered to talk to your representatives when they're doing what you want them to do and when they're not doing what you want them to do.
Thank you. Tim, anything to add on what you like to tell people, what they can do right now, how they can be involved in their communities?
Absolutely. There's 4 things that I like to tell folks these days that we need to be focused on. If we care about saving the people we love and the places that we love, now is the time for us to defend democracy, uphold the rule of law, stand up for science, and build community. And when I say build community, I mean, work with your friends and your neighbors, at that neighborhood level. It's not only essential for defending our democracy, it's also a way of strengthening our community's resilience. Because if you know your neighbors and they know you, and we suffer a natural disaster, we know to look in on certain neighbors that might be vulnerable. And so I think communities that are better connected are more resilient. So I would just say, whether it's at your city or town or county level, be visible in advocating for continued action on clean energy and climate change, and find ways to show up for and to support those marginalized populations and those that are now under attack. Because now more than ever, we're going to need to strengthen and maintain and build alliances across different sectors to repel those who are intent on tearing down institutions and promoting and prioritizing continued fossil fuel use, which is killing people and killing the planet.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate your time. Lashelle, thank you for your time, your wrap up, all of your information. I failed to get to questions during our session today. Very sorry about that. And we've run over 2 minutes, but in the chat, people can find a survey. They can find our Summer of Action bingo for some of those things that they can work on doing together. And we do have your questions, and many of you I will be getting back to you by email, or someone on our team will get back to you by email to answer your questions that way, or look out for a future conservation conversation about it. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.